Hello, everyone, and welcome to this interview series. Today, I'm super excited. I will be interviewing a very special scholar, Professor Omid Safi from the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, Duke University, USA. Um, I'm going to shortly tell you about the topic, but before I get to it, let's welcome the professor, and we have many exciting questions. Hello, Professor, and thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
Thank you, Rasoul Jan, and thank you for taking this time for us to have a conversation about such a beautiful and sublime topic.
I'm honored, and I'm sure the audience will enjoy this discussion. Now, we're going to be talking about a very interesting original work that Professor Safi has written, Radical Love, Teachings from the Islamic Mystical Tradition. Kind of an anthology. He has beautifully, elegantly put together texts from many Muslim scholars on the nature of love, different aspects towards love. We're going to be getting into it. But I want to tell the audience before we start that the book is interestingly available as a PDF for purchase at Yale Books. I will link it to the description so you can easily access it. Professor, before I start asking questions, would you like to please give us an introduction about yourself, like your past research, your future research?
Sure. So thank you so much again for this time. My primary topic of interest is Mazhab-i, as we would say in Persian, which I like to translate that as the path of radical love. And this is the path that has shaped the spiritual, the literary, the aesthetic, the intellectual output of many of our giants. So certainly Maulana Rumi, Hafiz, Attar, Sana'i, but also figures that in some ways determine their thought, but have sometimes been studied a little bit less. So people like Ahmad Ghazali, Ain al-Ghazat Hamedani, and also earlier sages like Abul Hasan Kharaqani. That's really what my life is devoted to, is to bring out in as best as I can the teachings and the worldview, the path that these sages have laid out for us. It's a fairly diffuse path, unlike what we get in some of the later Sufi tradition, where we have Sufi orders, tariqas, turuq, where we get the Qadiri order, the Ne'matullahi order, Chishti order, and so on. The Mazhab-i Ishq is more like when you wear perfume and you walk into a room. Its fragrance is detected in different places, but it's not always institutionalized and routinized in the way that the later Sufi traditions are. So it calls for a little different sensitivity. My first book was on the social and even political role of ulama and Sufis during the Saljuk era. So that included people like Muhammad Ghazali, Abu Hamid Muhammad al-Ghazali, Abu Sa'id Abu al-Khair, and Ain al-Ghazat. I have a book on the life of the Prophet Muhammad called Memories of Muhammad, which is written from this spiritual point of view. There's the Radical
So
Love
sorry
book.
for interruption. I
Sure,
apologize for interruption, but dear audience, I will link all books to the description.
of course. Yeah, thank you for doing that. And whenever there
Welcome.
are PDFs that are available, please do share them with the readers. They're there to be taken to heart and to read. Otherwise,
It's very
book.
generous of you.
Oh,
Thank you.
of course, of course. Books sitting on a shelf does about as much good as the old sages would say, books being carried by a donkey.
Right.
So,
Right.
so then there's the Radical Love book, which we'll be talking about today, and some of my forthcoming books. I've just finished a book, also through Yale, on the teachings of Abul Hasan Kharaqani. And then
Amazing.
one after that will be a reception history of the Masnavi in different contexts, Iran, Turkey, India, and Europe and North America. And then the one that I've been working on for a few decades, and inshallah will be coming out in a year or two, is an English translation and analysis of Ain al-Ghazat's Tamhidat, which is really one
Wow.
of the
That is
foundational
big.
texts. It is, and it's the Tamhidat is really one of the foundational texts
Mhm.
of the Mazhab-i ishq.
Amazing. I also saw that Professor Muhammad Rostam published a new book from Ain al-Ghazat Hamadani.
That's right. Rostam is a very good friend, and I'm very happy to see that the the work and the legacy of, as some people have called him, Sultan al-Ushaq,
Yeah.
is being brought to light. So this is it's a wonderful accomplishment, and none of us work alone. We all stand on the shoulders
Mhm.
of giants, and my own work in particular is very much indebted to the scholarship of the great Iranian scholar Nasrullah Purjavadi,
Mhm.
who has been an inspiration for many, many years.
Amazing. I'm so happy to see that the focus is also like before we had this all dominant Rumi, Hafiz, Sadi perspective, and especially Rumi. So much so that some quote don't even belong to Rumi. You see
Yeah,
on Instagram,
sure.
you know what I
Yes.
mean. So first of all, I'm happy that the reception book you mentioned is coming out. It can shed light on many of these matters. Second, Ghazat makes me happy because I've also been researching people uh, in shadow, like Faiz Kashani. Faiz Kashani is amazing theologian, amazing muhaddith, Quranic commentator. Talk about his poetry, there is no work.
Yeah.
I co-authored the first two ever papers written on his poetry, and he has magnificent poetry.
Yeah.
The third one is actually being published by Professor Rostam, Tokat Institute.
That's great.
And yeah, so I'm happy to hear about Enolzat. Is there anything you wish to add?
I think about some of my own um, engagement, entanglement with this tradition, and you cannot be an Iranian and not somehow be enamored of poetry. It's in the air. It's the sustenance for our soul, and
Right.
as some of the great sages like Ibn Arabi have said, everything that reveals God to you can also veil you from God. And ironically, sometimes I think that the distinctly Persian um, adoration of poetry and of love poetry has sometimes come with a cost. And the cost is that we miss out on the larger milieu out of which these figures emerge. So the analogy that I've sometimes used for people, and I am amongst those who is forever indebted to um, Jalaluddin Muhammad Balkhi, Hazrat Maulana, and as you said, there's a great deal of focus and emphasis on him. The way that he's oftentimes presented, the same thing is true for Hafiz, is as if you only see Mount Everest. You only see them as these solitary zenith points that soar higher and higher towards the heavens. And we forget that we don't get Mount Everest without also having the Himalayas. We don't get Damavand without having Alborz. And it's the whole mountain range of the Himalayas that is actually propping up Everest, and it's pushing it ever higher and higher. And likewise with Hazrat Maulana, by his time, there's already a 400-year mystical tradition. And so part of what I'm interested in, of course, there's a reason why we're so drawn to a Hazrat Maulana, to an Ibn Arabi, to a Hafiz. There's something about these extraordinary, luminous, divine dispensations that we're nothing other than grateful to them and for them. But I think what we're also called to do is to understand on whose shoulders do they stand. And none of these people are museum pieces. It's a river that's always flowing. There's always an interpretive tradition that follows them. And so understanding who are they drawing upon, right? And in my case, I'm interested in how is Hazrat Maulana drawing on Ahmad Ghazali? How is he drawing so deeply from that Khurasani ishq tradition, which is really one of the great contributions of a Persian Islamic civilization to humanity. And so, Maulana is not inventing these teachings. He might be bringing them to a particular perfection, but he's also playing with, benefiting from, drawing from this centuries-old tradition that predates him. And I think that's in particular something that I'm interested in. When I think about my own intellectual formation, there were quite a few years that, on one hand, I was reading love poetry of Maulana and Hafiz and Attar and others. And then, in other occasions, I was reading books about Islamic studies, which tend to proceed in a rather methodical way through Quran and Sunnah and Imams and fiqh and Sharia and falsafa and kalam and so on. And sometimes it was hard to see how these two things are part of the same world. The way, the very structured, methodical way that the world of Islamic studies is articulated, and this ecstatic world of love poetry. A lot of what I'm interested in is to notice that every literary and intellectual offering that has universal appeal, and I'm surely amongst those who thinks that the works of Maulana Rumi, of Ahmad Ghazali, of all these sages is universally relevant for all humanity, as is the work of Plato or the Bhagavad Gita or Tao Te Ching. But it's like a tree, and every tree has to be rooted somewhere. Trees are not rooted in clouds. And where they are rooted is a particular reading of the Quran, a particular connection to the Prophet, and a drawing upon an earlier mystical tradition that has had its own zenith points along the way. And I think we're still underway in terms of identifying that grounding as well as the flourishing and reaching fruition.
Amazing. Thank you very much. I do agree, especially with figures like Rumi, we have this problem. People either present him or understand him as if he just came out of nowhere. And even worse than that, they kind of stripe him off his Islamic origin and teachings and grounding, and they're just introducing this all new age, drunken by wine, dancing around, smelling flowers kind of guy. Yes, mystic intoxication is all over Rumi's poetry. Yes, wine is all over Rumi's poetry, but which wine? Even reading a translation would tell us what that wine is. But I'm afraid some people are seeking validation for personal interests through megapoets like Rumi. Do you have anything to say about that?
So, on one hand, I think you are absolutely right that there has been a whitewashing of Rumi, and we see in some cases an attempt to erase the particular Islamic and Persian roots of Rumi. And one has to scrutinize that tendency and ask the question, why is it that when we are reading Plato, there's no denying that he's a Greek philosopher, that he's part of a Greek tradition, and that the universally relevant applications of Plato's teachings um, have to be understood in the way that the Greek context shapes his thought. And yet, when it comes to Muslim figures, the understanding is that if they have a universal appeal, it can only be accomplished through uh, eradicating, rescuing them, as it were, from their milieu. So I think that is all true and valid. And frankly, it's also necessary for those of us who come from a Muslim background, those of us who have mastery of Persian and Arabic and Turkish and Urdu, to be better translators, right? We have to make sure that the translations that we come up with sing. They have to work as poetry in the new languages that we're working with. Otherwise, we end up with something that is stiff. And, you can tell people, as, the great English scholar Nicholson said, this is the greatest love poet that the world has ever known. And then you look at some of the wooden, stiff translations, and it's
Right.
it's it's just not poetry, right? So that's one valid criticism, the criticism that is extracting the Islam out of Rumi. I also think it's important for us to ask the complementary question and to make the complementary critique, which is that there is a parallel tendency, which is to extract not only Rumi, but that entire realm of aesthetics, poetry, mysticism, speaking of God as the beloved and the friend out of Islam. So we end up, as a result, with an Islam that sometimes seems cardboardish. And it is
Right.
one that it's quite dry, and becomes a caricature of of itself. And the analogy that I tell people is this hopefully would not be true in Iran, but it's certainly true in the West. You can go, and I have gone to many churches and even many synagogues and Buddhist temples and have the priest or the minister or the rabbi quoting Rumi. Not one time in my life have I been to a mosque where the imam is citing from Rumi. And there's something wrong with that, right? We cannot sit here and say, oh, Western people are appropriating Rumi when we don't know the value of our own treasure. And so,
That
and
is correct.
those in those times and points, um, we're reminded of what people like Hazrat Maulana say. What a pity that you are the veil on your own treasure.
Amazing. I do agree. And partly, well, if we get into like Rumi discussion, this conversation would never end. But just last point before I ask about radical love. I
Hmm.
think partly the reason why there is just hesitance against citing Rumi, say, like you said, in mosques, is because of the strictly legalistic perspective, like when it comes to religion. Would you agree with that?
All I would say is remember what Hazrat Maulana did in his daytime.
Hmm.
He taught hadith in a madrasa in the daytime. So
Mhm.
I just remind people he was a daytime scholar and a nighttime lover.
Right.
And so, partially, I think what we want to get to is an understanding that even our bifurcation into something that is legal and theological over here, and then something else that is mystical or spiritual, that bifurcation is really bifurcating the spirit from the body. And what is so special about someone like Maulana Rumi is the way, the seamless, effortless, spontaneous way in which hundreds, if not thousands, of Quranic verses and hadith of the Prophet, legal terminology, end up showing up in his teachings. And, there's a kind of fluidity that we are trying to recover. And that would be of benefit both to people who love poetry and love mysticism, and also to people who want to see a vibrant spiritual tradition. So I think this is to everybody, to all of our benefits, to identify the the flexibility, the overlap, the spontaneous emergence of this tradition.
And that spontaneous harmony is, I think, exactly why is that Rumi has become so universal, has been embraced by many, many traditions.
That's
Thank
right.
you so much, Professor.
Sure.
Now we're gonna everyone turn to the radical love. First, I plan to ask several questions through some direct quotes from the book to give you a taste of the book. At the end, we're going to be asking Professor Safi to what he hopes that emerges from this book. If there are further works, whether book or paper or academic avenues, what will make you happy to be the offspring of this book? But we're going to be saving that question to the end. Now, Professor, on page 5, you quote, you talk about Ahmad Ghazali, and then you bring this text: I will write you a book on radical love, provided you do not bifurcate it into divine love and human love. That's a beautiful, beautiful passage, but it also raises questions. You're highlighting Ghazali's warning not to bifurcate love into divine and human. Yet, in the scholarship, we always say divine love, human love, as if you're separating them. How does this refusal to divide became central to Mazhab-i ishq?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think this is really
Yeah.
the crux of the issue, and part of the reason for the confusion and sometimes the unhelpful language that is introduced is that, we're always in a rush to speak of something like the Sufi tradition as if it is one unified whole. And it's not. It has many different flavors, many different eruptions, many different um, tastes, zokes. So it's true that the earlier Sufi tradition, which never disappears, and in many places and in many parts of the world, it remains the dominant tradition. And truth be told, it also doesn't entirely disappear from Maulana's own writings. That earlier tradition talks about the existence of two modalities of ishq. There's the ishq majazi, metaphorical love, and ishq haqiqi, real love. And the way that they tended to talk about it was that ishq majazi, metaphorical love, is the love that you and I would share. It's the love that creation, humanity would share. Whereas ishq haqiqi is really God's love and the love for God. So in that earlier tradition, it's true. There is a bifurcation that is made. You can almost think of it as ishq majazi, metaphorical love. It's like the individual letters of the alphabet. You have to master it before you can compose a sonnet, a ghazal. Now, that tradition, which as I mentioned, never entirely goes away. And it's not unusual to see references to it in Maulana's own teachings, particularly when he's addressing the soul, when the soul is still caught up in its egoic structure, right? So if what you really end up loving about another person is not really their soul, but it's just, the attractiveness of their physical form, well, then, Maulana is likely to tell you that that physical form is going to die and it's going to change. And that the one who is a beautiful beloved today in 30 and 40 years will look like a grandpa or a grandma. And wouldn't you do better to turn to the one whose love is haqiqi and is beyond fading, right? So those kind of references are there, but that's because the nafs at that level can only see the surat, can only see the external form, and it has not yet learned to see the surat and the ma'na, the form and the formless, that which manifests and the hidden inner meaning together simultaneously. Where does Ahmad Ghazali come into play? So as I think your audience surely would know, we owe to Ahmad the fact that he writes the first Persian book on ishq, the Savaneh, which Ustad Purjavadi and Helmut Ritter have both edited, and Ustad Purjavadi translated it almost 50 years ago. And when Ahmad starts out writing of this book, in the introduction, he has to talk about why has he decided to write this book. Now, this was always an issue for pre-modern Muslim writers. Nowadays, contemporary people, myself included, the minute we have a thought, we have to put it on YouTube so that everybody knows that, oh, look, I had a thought. Whereas our pre-modern ancestors realized that writing is always an act of ego. At least it includes an element of ego. And so the question is, why write? And the most common answer that we got, this is almost a literary trope, is if it was up to me, I would have never written. But there were these friends and they begged me, they pleaded with me for their benefit to write something. So, and this is exactly what Ahmad does. And there's no reason, by the way, to see this as a mere literary device. No one doubts that there was actually a friend who said, oh, Ahmad, when I'm with you, God is real, love is real, all of this is real. And then I go home and I forget. So write me something that I can go home and keep this feeling alive, right? That happens in any spiritual gathering. And so Ahmad writes him this book, which we have now as the Savaneh. And then he starts out by saying that I'm going to write this book in a few chapters on the ma'ani ishq, on the inner meanings of ishq, of radical love, even though the reality of love cannot be made to fit into words. Love is something that you have to live into, something that you have to give experience to. And he uses very erotic language, right? He says, it's as if the inner meaning of love is like a virgin bride, and that the hand of men have not even touched her hem, her skirt, right? It's the language of longing, of union, of reaching, of needing, of desiring, of longing for that inner meaning. And so he says, my task is to create a wedding chamber when words about love and the
Amazing.
inner experience of love can have union, right? So
Amazing.
it's this highly sensual, even writing itself is a sensual metaphor for him. And he says, so, I'm going to create this wedding chamber. I'm going to write you this book on ishq on one condition. And that's the passage that you read about. He says, چنانکه تعلق به هیچ جانب ندارد در حقایق عشق و احوال و اغراض عشق به شرط آنکه در او هیچ حواله نبود نه به خالق و نه به مخلوق. So I'll write you this book on love as long as you don't try to restrict it to as if this ishq is only about the khaliq, the creator, or only about the makhluk, creation. So he's talking about something else. He's talking about something a little bit more subtle. I always tell my students that this is like the reggae musician Bob Marley, who has that great song "One Love." I was like, we did one love. We did one love 1,000 years ago. Rather than seeing love as two, love as split, Ahmad Ghazali is telling us that there's one love. And later on in the Savaneh, in the 58th chapter, he uses a reference to the Quran. So every Sufi book on love comes back to that ayah from the Quran, from Surah Al-Ma'idah, and in that modern Muslim way where people identify things by chapter and verse, chapter 5, verse 54. No pre-modern Muslim ever gave chapter and verse. This is such a Protestant disease that has infected all of us. They just expected that you were familiar with the Quran. And if you're not, then you shouldn't be reading this book.
They didn't even cite. They don't
No,
even
that's right.
cite. They
There's
just
no,
recite and move on.
that's it. And they don't give you the whole verse, right?
Right.
It's just enough for them to say, yuhibbuhum,
Mhm.
and you should know
Mhm.
the rest of it. Or if they're citing hadith, it's enough to say kanzan makhfiyan,
Right.
and you should know
Reminds me
that
of
this
Ibn
is
Arabi. He doesn't care at
absolutely,
all about citation. Like when Ibn
absolutely.
Arabi writes,
Yep.
he's just amazing.
Because they're swimming in it, because they're so
Right.
in the ocean that they expect their audience to be as well. So that verse of the Quran, God will bring forth a people. God loves them and they love God. Yuhibbuhum wa yuhibbunahu. Every Sufi who writes about love comes back to this verse. Right? It's and what they love about it, of course, is that it uses the root word of hub, mahabba, or mohabbat, as we would say in Persian, to talk about this model of one love. And what does Ahmad Ghazali say in the Savaneh? He's trying to make the argument that God's love for us and the love that we express are actually one. So he talks about it through this beautiful metaphor of gardening. Gardening. Asl ishq as qadam rabad. So the root of love has come from non-existence, from pre-eternity. And he says, it's as if, and he takes the letter B, which in Arabic and Persian has a noqte, a dot under it, right? So hub is ha and be. And he says, it's as if the noqte, the dot under the be of yuhibbuhum, God loves them, has been planted in the fertile soil of yuhibbunahu, and we love God. Yuhibbuhum به تخمی در زمین یحبونه افکندند. And this is done actually in the home, in them, in us, in humanity, until we love has emerged from it. And then this is the key. When the flower of ishq, of radical love, comes out, so very subtly he's shifted from the Quranic language of hub to the quite distinctly Persian and Persianate language of ishq, radical love. When it comes out, the seed is of the same color as the fruit. The seed, تخم همرنگ ثمره بود و ثمره همرنگ تخم. In other words, the love that God has planted in the soil of our soul, the love that God has planted in the soil of our soul leads forth to a flower, to a fruit, human love, which is of the same color and the same essence and the same nature as divine love, right? So he's not talking about this the way that a peripatetic philosopher would, right? There's no discussion really of Aristotelian categories. He's talking about it using the language of myth, poetry, and symbols, which has always been the beauty of our tradition.
Wonderful. I do agree. And this love is so unique that many people from outside the tradition usually mistake it. They mistake it to the physical love or the worldly love alone. I mean, like reducing it to physicality alone. Yes, that too can become like a doorway to the divine love. We're not separating it, like the whole discussion you have in this book, but it's still like limiting it to that level is doing injustice.
I agree. And I think that tendency is true for two populations in particular. One, it's the dominant way in which, for example, Hazrat Maulana ends up being read in the West, where the discussions about ishq are simply read as if it is talking exclusively about human love, romantic love, physical love, sexual love. And what is the distinguishing feature of Persian love poetry in a mystical context is exactly that. A love poem can be about your wife, your husband, your beloved, your spiritual teacher, the Prophet Muhammad, and God. And here's the beauty of it. It's usually about all of those simultaneously, all at once. And the register keeps shifting and changing. And so that attempt to collapse it onto purely and exclusively a human romantic, physical, sexual love is flattening it. It's almost as if an earthquake has devastated the landscape of our poetry, and where you once had gardens, now there's just flat earth. And I will say, and I'll try to be delicate about this point, it's not only Westerners who do this. Some of the same tendency, unfortunately, it's also evident among some of our own fellow countrymen who, for philosophical reasons, are not really willing, they're able, but they're not willing to see the sacred references that are everywhere in Maulana Rumi and in Hafiz. And they too, ironically, want to read it exclusively to be talking about the realm of human love And I think both of those tendencies, unfortunately, are missing out on the fuller, richer context of this literature.
True. And it's not that we are just disregarding that physical aspect, disregarding the worldly aspect of love,
Absolutely.
but it's like it works both way. We don't have to like reduce it to that level. It's not that when you anyways, so I have been working on this channel for some years now, and I have been dedicating most of my videos to Rumi. That topic is so painful that I haven't created a direct video on that. Rumi's view on love, specifically on love, what he means by that, and specifically on wine. It's just so clear for us what it means that it doesn't need defending. It's there. Just open the book and it's all over. Just read a couple of verses, you will understand. We're not talking about physicality alone.
Yeah, and I'll mention this. One of the main reasons that this is the subject of the next book that I'm writing, which is the reception history of Hazrat Maulana in all these different contexts. One of the main reasons I think for that flattening in certain pockets, I'm not saying this is true for all Iranians, of course, or all Persian speakers, but it's true in certain pockets, is that we largely read Hazrat Maulana through his poetry, right? What we don't do is to situate the poetry in what we know about his life. So the two biographies of Hazrat Maulana that we have, the one by Aflaki, Manaqib al-Arifin, and the one by Sepah Salar, they provide hundreds and hundreds of pages of detail about his life. And once we situate the love poetry in the context of what we know about his life, once we also read his Friday sermons in the Majalis, well, then we get a much richer sense of that perspective.
In our conversation before the meeting, I said that I'm working on the problem of evil and suffering from perspective of Rumi and John Hick. I came across this passage in Fihi Ma Fihi, and it was very interesting to me to see Rumi, the love-intoxicated poet, gives rational argumentation
Of course.
about the problem of evil, about the free will, and it was so interesting to me. So I agree. When we put that poem in the context of his life, in the context of our writings, different things emerge.
Can I add one example just before we
Please,
move on to the next topic?
please,
This is one
please.
of my favorite ones because it's such a real life example, and it really does go against this image of Hazrat Maulana as this, free loving, tripped out hippie that sometimes he's represented as being. In his letters, there's a very tender, very moving episode where his own son is coming to him and he's saying to his Baba, Baba, I am caught up in this loveless marriage. My wife doesn't seem to care for me. And guess what? I found this other woman. And she's everything that I want. And she's so beautiful. And I feel so excited when I'm near her. So you're always talking about ishq. Can I have permission to go and chase this other woman? Very interesting to see what he would say. And he writes a letter to him and he says, my dear son, the light of my eyes, the love of my life, don't do it. Don't do it. Don't. What you are chasing is a mirage in a desert. It appears like the sweet water of life to you, but the more you chase it, the more it will retreat from you. The love that you seek is right at home waiting for you. Take your longing, take your desire, invest it in your home. And then he ends the letter by saying, free your father from worrying about you. so that I can return to praying for you. Right? Now,
Wow.
that
Wow.
Rumi, that Hazrat Maulana doesn't really fit our
Mhm.
model of, this hippie free love, um, California American mystic. And of course, it always has to be said, he's writing a letter to his son, right? This is not advice
Mhm.
that is true for all people of all time who might find
Mhm.
themselves in a loveless marriage, but to his son,
Right.
in that particular saying, don't do it, don't do it, don't. Free your father from worrying about you so I can return to praying for you.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I have not seen that passage. It was beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, I have a spontaneous question, which is going to be tying kind of to my next question. So the spontaneous question is, why the radical love? Um, but the question following that is this: I would like to quote a part of the book, a beautiful, beautiful paragraph. You say on page 1, for the mystics of the path of radical love, love, that is ishq in Farsi, is not a sentiment or an emotion. It is the very overflowing of God onto this realm, that is the material world. It is this radical love that erupts out of God, bringing us into being, emphasizing, bringing us into being. It is this love that sustains us, and it will be the cosmic current that will carry us back home. That's a powerful paragraph, and there are so many things going on there. Kind of reminds us of Plotinus's emanation theory, or the Sudur theory, as we like to call it in Islamic thought. But um, first, how does this framing change our usual understanding of spirituality and everyday affection? And two, how does this perspective reconcile the real's transcendence and immanence in relation to the world? So
Yeah.
overall, three questions, starting
Okay.
with the radical. What radical?
Of course. Of course. Well, of course, that word radical has taken on a whole new connotation,
Right.
particularly when it comes to Islam and Muslims. And
Yes.
I was recently told, by the way, I have a podcast where we talk about these things, and the provider called it. It wasn't the title I chose. Sufi Heart. And I had
Mm.
asked them when we started, I was like, well, I really want it to be called Radical Love because the book is Radical Love and the podcast would go along with it. And they said, well, we tried to register the name Radical Love, but the name got rejected because they thought that a Muslim author,
Right.
speaker, talking about something radical has a very
Right.
different kind of a connotation. They thought it
Right.
would trigger all kinds of
Wow.
terrorism watch. And so, I mean,
Wow.
even when you're talking about love and ishq and Rumi, that's still the world in which we live.
I
um
will never forget that.
yeah, yeah. So, but I'm a scholar. I love languages, and so I pay attention to the etymology of words. So the word radical, of course, has two meanings. One of them is something that is extreme. But then the older meaning of it is to go back to the roots of something. That's the English etymology of radical, which, when you start to think about Molana starting the Masnavi with هذا كتاب المثنوي وهو أصول الدين, right? This is the root of the root of the root of religion. If you wanted to translate it, you could say that what Molana is saying in the first line of the Masnavi is that this is the Masnavi and this is some radical, radical, radical stuff, right? That's what it is to go back to the root of something. And then the Sufis themselves, when they were asked to distinguish between hub or mahabba, muhibbat, and ishq, right? Sometimes, as Molana does in the Masnavi, they're like, oh, they both mean the same thing. But most often they said, ishq is ifratul mahabba. Ishq is muhabba when it goes beyond the bounds, when it refuses to be contained, right? So there's that sense of love when it becomes overflowing, when it becomes abundant. And then, as far as the God being unleashed on earth, look, ever since Plotinus, one of the questions that many religious traditions have had to grapple with is, how is the one related to the many? How do you get the oneness of God and the apparent manyness of creation? And we have different answers to this, right? We have the Wahdat al-Wujud tradition, a term that Ibn Arabi himself doesn't seem to have used, but it becomes associated with his school, which takes being, wujud, but remembering that being is not some European kind of static notion, that for Sufis, wujud always has a sense of wajd, which is ecstasy, right? There's something ecstatic about the universe coming into being, which I think sometimes we forget when we read Sufism in light of a Western philosophical tradition, right?
Which is a lot.
Which is a lot, yeah. It's probably because many of the scholars who study Islamic philosophy, their initial training is in Western philosophy, right? And
Right, I agree.
and so we have that.
I was also like that. I'm afraid I was also like that. It took years to, reset.
You've detoxified
Yes, but
from
after
that.
years.
Yes, and we have the Ishraqi tradition of Shahabuddin Sohrawardi, where Nur is the metaphor that we use to talk about the relationship of the one and the many. And here, of course, in the Mazhab-i ishq tradition, love is the way that the one and the many are related to one another. The way that someone like a Maulana Rumi talks about this is not through a theological discussion, but again, it's through poetry. And so there's a poem that I have in the book on page 73. Persian audiences would know this one, of course. It is unforgettable because of the recitation of great masters like the late Ustad Shajarian, Man ghulam qamaram, ghayr qamar hich magu, right? I serve that moon-like beauty, say nothing to me unless it's about her. And, that poem is such a powerful gift for us. In it, Maulana is having an experience, a visionary experience, a dreamlike experience of witnessing love, ishq, being embodied in this most beautiful form. دوش دیوانه شدم عشق مرا دید و بگفت آمدم نعره مزن جام مدر هیچ مگو. I've come, don't shout, don't tear your clothes apart, هیچ مگو, say nothing. And that's the refrain of the poem, say nothing, which is sweetly ironic for a poet who writes 60,000 lines of poetry.
Right.
Right. That's the finger pointing at the moon, that the task of poetry is not to exhaust God, it's to take you to that inner space where God is revealed in silence, right? And then, he says, "Goftam ey ishq, man az cheez digar mitarsam." I said, "Oh, love, I'm afraid of something else." And ishq says, "Goft an cheez digar neest, digar hich magu." There is nothing else. I'm all there is. I am all. Love is all. And then, Rumi starts to, through the narrator of the poem, he starts to figure out, well, what is this being that I'm having this dialogue with? Are you a ferishte? Are you an angel? Are you a bashar? Are you a human creature? And he's like, no, I'm not an angel. I'm not a human. And he starts to go a little crazy. He's like, I'm zero zebar khoham shod. And he's like, okay, stay right there, stay in that
Right.
burning. And then here comes the clincher line of the poem. گفتم ای دل پدری کن نه که این وصف خداست. I said, have some mercy.
Mm,
Treat me lovingly like a parent would.
mm,
Isn't what you're describing the quality of God? نه که این وصف خداست.
mm,
گفت این هست ولی جان پدر
mm,
هیچ مگو. Says it is, but the
mm.
soul of your father, like my beloved offspring, say nothing.
Wow,
And
I never thought of that poem like in that connection. Wow,
yeah, and that's
like
something that, of course,
Vasfe Khuda.
Vasva Khodas, right? And
Wow.
that's something that we get in the Mazhab-i ishq tradition, where they gently take you from thinking about our task is to love God, right? That we are the ashiq and God is the mashuq. And the Mazhab-i ishq tradition says, no, God himself, herself is ashiq, ishq, and
Mm,
mashuq. It is God who loves God through us. And Abul Hasan Kharagani has a beautiful, beautiful way that he explains this, and I'll just pause after this. He gets to that quintessential passage in the Quran, which is really the seat of our whole spiritual experience, the Alastu Barabbakum.
mhm,
Am I not your cherishing, sustaining Lord? And the whole goal of our spiritual life, the whole goal of zikr, the whole goal of sama, the whole goal of contemplation and meditation is to return to that original pure state where we beheld God. Hmm? And Kharagani says, we were all there, every human being who's ever been, we were all there together, witnessing and beholding God as the Shahid, as the beautiful beloved, but we heard it according to our capacity. And so he says, some of us heard God asking, am I not your Rab? Am I not your Lord? Am I not the one who cherishes you, sustains you, nurtures you? And we all said yes. He says, a little bit above that are the ones who heard it as, am I not your doost? Am I not
mm.
your friend? Am I not the one who loves you? Doost. And of course,
Wow.
doost is one of the Mazhab-i ishq code words for God.
Mhm.
Um,
Rumi uses all the time.
all the time, all the time.
Mhm,
Every whirling dervishes ceremony, right?
mhm,
Sama ceremony starts out with Ya Hazrat Maulana Haq Doost, right? It's a
mhm.
pun. Haq Doost. God is my friend, but Maulana is the Doost of Haq. And the Sufis always remind us that the very last word uttered by the Blessed Prophet, the chosen one, Hazrat Mustafa, alayhi salatu wassalam, was Ar-Rafiq al-Ala, the highest friend,
Mhm.
right? I choose the highest friend. So the second meaning is, am I not your doost? Am I not your friend? But then Kharaqani says, and there's a special rank of people who heard Alastu birabbikum as God saying, am I not all? Am I not the only being? Am I not the only thing that is in existence? Now,
Wow.
and that's his three-level interpretation of Rab,
Amazing.
Doost, Hame, right? And Attar, of course, also has his famous Hameust, Hameust. And so that's also a part of the Mazhab tradition.
Thank you so much for that poem. And it was all spontaneous, but this is the poem that has kept me, awake at nights. There's this part of it that I've been stuck for years. But that part that you mentioned is an amazing link. That last part where Rumi said, I said, my heart, isn't this God's quality?
Yeah.
You're saying that here he's referring to love as God's quality.
عشق از
That
وصف
is
خدا.
huge.
Yeah.
That is
And
huge.
that's an example of, in order to understand that reference, we have to know that
Mhm.
Hazrat Maulana has read Attar,
Right.
and Attar talks about God as Hame Oost. And then Hazrat Maulana is intimately familiar with um, Kharaqani, whom, at one point in the Masnavi, when he's asked to describe him, he just calls him Nur, 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 6 times. He just says, what can I
Mm.
say about him? He was light of light of light of light of light of light of light. And so he's coming from the Khorasan region that Kharaqani comes from. He's familiar with the teachings of Kharaqani. And the more we see Hazrat Maulana as an heir to this century-long tradition of Kharaqani and Abu Sa'id and Ahmad Ghazali and Ain al-Quzat and Attar and Sana'i, I think the better we understand his
Mm.
references.
Beautiful. You gave me a lot to contemplate there. So let me ask you a question from here, the part that I'm stuck.
Okay.
Um, Rumi is having this dialogue with God, as Professor Safi pointed out. And this dialogue goes on and on and on. Amazing, amazing poem. One of Rumi's most elegant poems.
Hmm.
از قمری جان صفتی در ره دل پیدا شد در ره دل چه لطیف است سفر هیچ مگو. Just the translation off the top of my head. A moon-like figure appeared on the path of love. On the path of love, how sweet it is. Journeying, something like that. I'm just
Yeah,
paraphrasing.
sure.
Then, see, here it says, قمری جان صفتی پیدا شد. A moon-like figure appeared. Then he's in wonder. گفتم ای عشق. Rumi is asking love. گفتم ای عشق. گفتم ای عشق عجب این روی فرشته است عجب یا بشر است. Is this the figure or face of an angel or human? See, there's a personhood there. That
Yep,
is important. There
that's
is a
right.
personhood there.
Yep, yep.
We cannot say, oh, that's just love. No, it's not. We're talking about a personhood. گفتین غیر فرشته است و بشر. هیچ نگو. As you have translated, love said, not an angel, not a human, say nothing. So what is that? What category is that? I've been stuck with this question for a long, long time. Not a
Yeah.
human, not an angel. We cannot say it's something ontological, like love, an ontological force, because of the personhood. And Rumi loves doing that. He doesn't answer it. He leaves it open.
Yeah. Yeah. So I can give you an insight about how someone like Ain al-Quzat can get you unstuck here, right? So this is the insight that Ain al-Quzat has in the Tamhidat. Okay. And he takes you back. One of the main reasons that I'm so fascinated by Ain al-Quzat is Ahmad Ghazali. Reading Ahmad Ghazali is a little bit like reading Platonic dialogues, right? It's a beautiful, dense prose, impregnated with a few lines of poetry here and there. What Ain al-Quzat, Ahmad Ghazali's, of course, student, and it's the picture of the two of them that's on the cover of the Radical Love book. What Ain al-Quzat does is to make explicit everything that Ahmad Ghazali has been talking about by connecting it, or I would say revealing the Quranic and the Hadith references. So almost every line or every other line of the Tamhidat includes a reference to the Quran or a reference to the Hadith Qudsi or the prophetic Hadith collections. And when he gets to talking about the story of Hazrat Maryam in the Quran, like Virgin Mary, he does something really beautiful. So this is in Surah Maryam, named after Virgin Mary. And he talks about how Hazrat Maryam retreats to a place in the east when the time comes to give birth to Hazrat Isa, to Jesus. And she secludes herself, right? فاتخذت من دونهم حجابا فأرسلنا إليها روحنا فتمثل لها بشرا سويا. So God saying, we sent our spirit, which is one of the, of course, titles of Hazrat Isa is Ruhullah. We sent our spirit to Maryam, فتمثل. تمثل. And this spirit comes to take on the form of a creature. And then Ain al-Ghazat and some other Sufis, I think Ibn Arabi also has a reference to this as well. Tamathala is the form of a misal. It allegorizes
Imaginal
itself.
form.
That's right. So, I mean, in one tradition, it goes on to the whole alam misal and what have you, but literary wise, it's also an allegory. It's the way that the formless comes to clothe itself at the level of forms.
Wow.
And I think this is something that I would love to explore a little bit more in the future. So this is not a fully finished it's not pukhte, as Maulana might say. And again, there's no uniformity in all of the Sufi tradition. Sometimes they say things like, and Maulana himself says things like, the goal is to get over the surat and to see the ma'na. Sometimes he says things like, the goal is to get over the foam on top of the ocean and to dive deep into the ocean where the pearls are. I think that's one voice. And another voice is to hold together the Jan and the Tan, the body and the soul, to simultaneously make space for the Surat and the Ma'na. And in that context, the form, the level of form, is not something to be discarded. It is a bridge that you keep walking across to get to the inner realities, and you walk back. And the form is also of God. And so, for example, surat form is tied to one of the divine names, Ya Musawwir.
Right.
So the surat cannot be entirely discarded any more than any of the divine names could ever be discarded.
Divine name Al-Zahir.
That's right. And
Outward.
the batin. That's right.
Very explicit.
Yeah.
Non-interpretation.
That's right. And Attar has a wonderful story. I wish I could remember which Sufi it is that he's talking about, but he talks about a Sufi who's walking around, and as a meditation, he keeps repeating himself, Ya batin, oh, the hidden inward. And the voice that he hears from heaven is and az-zahir. God is not only the hidden inward, God is also. And I won't name names, but I do think this has been an issue in the study of the Sufi tradition, which is quite pervasive, which is sometimes people who tend to prioritize what they might term as the esoteric dimension really see the external, the manifest, the form, the imaged as something shallow, something that is ultimately to be transcended. And I don't think the Mazhab-i ishq tradition is really one ultimately of transcendence. I think it is to find the harmony between the form and the formless, between transcendence and immanence, between the love of God and the love of creation. And that's the reason why we're not ultimately called to abandon family, to abandon community, to abandon relationship and go sit on the mountaintop. We are intended to sanctify where we are through the presence that endures.
Beautiful. It reminded me of part of Fih Ma Fih. Rumi talks about monasticism there, and very respectful towards Christianity and
Yeah.
Jesus Christ, peace be upon him. And then he, given that he's talking about monasticism, he says the prophet of Christianity's path was that of monasticism, but the Prophet Muhammad says, my path differs in a sense that God showed me a better way, that is marriage. And that
Yeah.
was shocking for me. This is Rumi, like the Rumi that we see on the West usually, is that you should see your spouse as a self-cleanser.
Yeah.
In an inward sense. Your kid gets on your nerves, your spouse makes you angry. That's purifying you, and vice versa. That's a mutual relationship. And that's a wonderful perspective. It brings spirituality right into your home, right
Absolutely.
into your, family
Absolutely.
life.
Absolutely. Let me give two very short references for this that I think are helpful. I was recently having this conversation actually with one of my very dear friends about this issue of the goal is not somehow to arrive at this impersonal model of
Mm.
spirituality, but one that holds room and space for something that is relational, that is familial, that is based on actual love of real human beings, and not just merely
Right,
the archetype. You don't sit there
right.
meditating on the archetype of love. You also have to learn to love real, messy, complicated, difficult human beings. And so I'll give two short examples. One of them is, of course, we all know that Sheikh al-Akbar, Ibn Arabi, writes the Fusus al-Hikam, and he comes to associate a different hadith with each of the different prophets. And then when he gets to Hazrat Muhammad, alayhi salatu wasalam, of all the million hadiths that he could have chosen, the chapter that he chooses
Right.
is perfumed with that hadith of from this world of yours, I was made to love three.
Mm.
Perfume, women, but the thing that delights my soul, brings coolness to my eyes, as the Arabs would say, is prayer. And Ibn Arabi's chapter is a meditation on why it is that women, relationality,
Mhm.
is the mediating principle between perfume, which is really nature, and prayer as the shorthand for relationship with God. And it's that sensual space in the middle that for Ibn Arabi is the distinctly, if you would use the term Muhammadan,
Mhm.
Muhammadi
Mhm.
spiritual trait. Now, we have some work to do with that chapter. And many of
Right.
us would want to also ask the question, well, what does that mean for women? Is he talking about women because the passage is related to the prophet and he's talking about his love for Hazrat Khadija and Hazrat Fatima
Mhm.
and so on? And then if we were talking about the point of view of Hazrat Maryam, the metaphor would have
Mhm.
looked a little different. Sure. And that's another discussion to have. Um, the other thing, and I may, with your permission, kind of
Please,
start to wrap things up by
please.
at this, but this is one of my favorite metaphors of Hazrat Maulana, one of the favorite stories of Hazrat Maulana. And it's really these kinds of stories that I would love to see Iranian audiences take to heart more, It comes up from Aflaki, from Manaqib al-Arifin. So this is an early story. It's compiled from people who are gathering the story from people who knew Molana, right? This is not some apocryphal thing centuries down the road. And the story is about Molana and his wife when Molana is approaching death. And it's clear that his time on earth is coming to an end. And it's time to return home. And Aflaki includes a passage from the point of view of his wife. And she is absolutely devastated, completely beside herself, weeping. And she calls him Jan Jahanam, right? You're the soul of my whole world. Where am I going to find another one like you? How am I ever going to love anyone with your deep and volcanic love again?
Beautiful.
Right?
Beautiful.
And he, because he's Hazrat Maulana, he writes a poem for her. And
In
so
deathbed.
On the deathbed, because why not? And
Yeah.
the poem is, I'll give it in a translation. He says this: in this world, I have had two attachments. One has been to my body, the other has been to you. The time has come for two-ness to become unity, and I am now asked to let go of one of these attachments.
Wow.
So I'm letting go of the body so that the soul can return home. As for the love that you and I have shared, that love had no beginning and it will have no end, and I am yours forever.
Amazingly beautiful.
Yeah. I think
Incredible.
that's Mazhab-i ishq. That's
Right.
someone who loves God, loves his community, loves Shams, and loves his wife with this eternal love where death is only a door, and we walk through that door and find the same love in another garden.
Incredibly beautiful. Thank you very much for this.
Alhamdulillah.
Professor, I know you don't have much time. I really, really appreciate the time you took out of your busy schedule to enlighten me and the audience who will be listening to this. Normally, I don't put people I'm having interview with on the spot, but I'm gonna break that here. Would you please promise us that you will be joining for another episode in the future?
Well, all that time is for, to get to honor time, is really one of the great um, disciplines of our tradition. It's
Mhm.
the reason why the Sufis are usually called Ibn al-Waqt or Bint
Right.
al-Waqt. We're supposed to be children of the moment. And in the highest point of the Mi'raj, when the chosen one, when Hazrat Mustafa is asked, what was it like? Uh, all he says is, I had a moment with my Lord. Had a
Mhm.
moment, I had a waqt with my Lord. And so what an incredible honor it is to get to wander together with you and with our viewers, with our listeners, in the garden of these great lovers of God, and to pick a few flowers to come home. And may it be that, as Ahmad Ghazali says, that we're planting these seeds in the fertile garden of our heart, and let's see what emerges. It would be my honor to be back, inshallah.
First of all, the honor is all mine and the audience's, I'm sure. Second, what a beautiful way of saying yes. I loved it.
Alhamdulillah. Thank you.
Professor, thank you very much again for accepting this interview, for spending this much time with us. And I hope you have a wonderful day.
حتما عزیزم. خیلی ممنون. Thank you so much with
Thanks,
much love
Bana.
and appreciation to you all.
Thank
All right.
you too.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Bye
Bye
bye.
bye. Bye bye.